My name is Eduardo. I'm the QA director for Mopomo, and my job is to create and improve software quality assurance standards company-wide. On my free time, I love spending time with my dogs in open space. I have two greyhounds. They're awesome. And today I'm here to talk to you about why metrics, how metrics, and do I even need them? What we're going to do is we're going to go through a brief introduction with a very simple example. It has actually nothing to do with software. Then we will target each of those questions, why, how, and do I even need them, followed up by a brief conclusion. So to start off, a brief history of why I chose to talk about this. Last year, we did a presentation about buzzwords. Buzzwords are technical terms that have not much left of their original technical meaning because they're used in fashion, like they're fashionable words, and they're terms used to simply impress others. Stuff like artificial intelligence, future-proof, AI, those terms that could seem like you're talking about something, and without the proper context, they mean nothing. Now, this past year, I wanted to focus on metrics. It was one of the buzzwords, and over this year, it has kind of evolved, or at least it's a buzzword that has become more than a buzzword. A new term has risen, which is called vanity metrics. And what happened is people started gathering values without actually getting metrics, and they started acting upon them and using them for certain things that they're not supposed to be used for. As I mentioned, data gathering is not the same as having metrics. You cannot start gathering traits of a process and think that that will help you understand it or act upon it. They need to have meaning. Some other thing that it's common use is using them to compare things, compare projects, compare values, and that's not the essence of it. If the conditions are not met, you might be talking to different languages altogether. You might be talking about hours, man hours, story points, ticket count, and the numbers are obviously going to be different. So before we get into that toxic concepts of what metrics are not, let's try to take a step back and introduce the idea with a very simple case study. We're going to be talking about the Empire State Building. It's obviously a US icon, one of the biggest buildings in Manhattan. It's over 100 stories tall. It's a massive 80,000 square foot per floor building. And it's so massive that it has over 70 lifts. And the first time I got to read about this, I was impressed by the time it took to complete it. And I started digging over it. It astonished me that it was built in a little over a year. And the fastest it got was more than 4 stories per week, which would mean that they would have completed the building I'm currently on in 10 days. That's insane at that rate, right? Now, most interesting was how they got to do it so fast. And the answer requires some explanation by itself. So they maximized the tons of steel delivered to the building site. In order to understand why they did this, we need to see what a process for a building would be. So basically, if you strip it down to the bare minimum, you gather materials, you work with the materials, and then at some point when you're done, you have no more materials, you put it all into a building form, then you just need to make sure that it's safe to use and you have your inauguration ceremony. At that time, it's the 1930s, there was a lot of manpower available because of depression, its history. So it makes sense that they focused on gathering materials. That part makes sense. And if you go deeper and think about all the materials that are required, you need to take into account that Manhattan is one of the most dense cities. So the transport of each of those materials had to be weighted in. Obviously, the bulkier, the worse it would be as a logistic nightmare. And if you consider that the steam beams were custom made and brought in big chunks, makes sense that those would be the harder things to bring into the construction site. And that's what they did. They just had tracks 24 hours straight going into and out of the site. They would have this massive scales to weight them on their way in and on their way out. And it is said that the lead engineer had a small book where he wrote the amount of steel that got delivered to the site each day. And another problem they had was, if you're pouring in a lot of steel into the construction site, there might be an excess of steel, so you need to put it into the building as fast as possible. What they did was, I think they placed the rivets on the ground, so when they got put into the building, they just had to be hammered in. So they got the steel into the site and into the building as fast as possible, which talks a bit about a review and improve process where they saw that they were having excess of steel, and they had to improve the process to make it go into the building faster. And that's basically the essence of how this whole thing works. Now, metrics are just numbers, tons of steel. They're numbers that tell you important information about a process under question. They tell you accurate measurements about how the process is functioning and provide a base for you to suggest improvements. That's it. Now, hopefully, now that you know what they are, if you hear that word in a context that it makes no sense, or the person that actually says metrics can't provide an analysis of why that value correlates to something in a process, then you know it's just an empty buzzword. Okay, I kind of stated a couple of benefits of having them, but I think we can jump on to the first question, which is why metrics? Metrics basically provide a control and feedback loop. This is what we were talking before. You need quantifiable data or values to help you understand if the project is sane or you need to improve it. It also makes the process objective because values are values. If they're chosen correctly, they're not open to interpretation, and people cannot manipulate them to show something that is not correct about the process. And also, we always talk about SMART objectives and objectives being able to be quantified, but it's very difficult when you go into practice. If you do have a metric-driven business, it's quite easy to define a goal in terms of metrics, and you can actually scale the benefit of interaction or changes or enhancements that are applied to the business. And for the sake of what we're going to be talking about now, I want to make a bit of a distinction between the types of metrics and what they're used for. So you have operational, which are the ones we are most used to. They are the ones that target the process of building the actual product. And then there are other metrics that go into the financial, which just judge the ability of an organization to convert that operational performance into financial goals. So it's like the first step into going into KPIs, which are kind of the same thing, but for business objectives. And this goes into the fact that usually you don't just have one metric, you have a collection that helps you define the process effectively, and also it provides redundancy to the system to make sure that you're measuring things correctly. So this is what metrics give you. It's essentially a simple concept, but to get it, it's a different story. So let's jump into the second one, how do you gather metrics? The first step would be process definition. So you need to have a process in order to measure it. And in your current state, you might be not ready. So the first thing you need to do is describe what you're currently doing, go through the documents, interview people if required, review past information about other projects that have been completed already. And when you're certain that you're onto something, then you need to go through training and make the necessary changes. An important thing is that everyone across the company uses the same vocabulary to express the same things so that there is consistency in communication. And this last step is what's called standardization. It's a very important step towards everyone understanding everything when it gets reported. Okay, so now you have some sort of process definition. The next step would be to identify key factors within the processes that will help you understand what are the main risks, what do you feel might eventually be problems in that cycles, and what aspect or parts of the process have the most impact on the outcome. And once you do that, you're gonna start gathering information about it. So basically, you want to do data sampling to avoid ambiguity. Try to stay objective as far as what you're trying to relayed as information towards that key factor that you've identified. And then you might need to avoid being ambiguous when you go to collect data, especially if calculations are involved, because if at some point you see a fault, then you cannot attribute it to only the data gathering. You might also be looking into the calculations and it becomes messy. But just to sum up, 3 stages to get a metric. You need process definition, identify the key factors within the process, and then start gathering information that might tell you things about that key factor. And that's how a metric is born. To make this a bit more clear, let's talk about an example. We're finally going to go into the Drupal world. And in order to make something out of it, we need to provide some context. So let's talk about a simple product with trusted modules and little to no custom code. So basically how this would work is kind of a resource allocation kind of contract where you have a developer and a tester that receive tickets from the client, work on them, and then produce an outcome. And the way this would work is the client would provide a task to be carried out and an acceptance criteria, so a list of things that need to be accomplished for that ticket to be considered closed, kind of a task order. The developer then writes the code for that ticket and it gets tested. That happens internally. The tester can either pass it or fail it, depending on if the functionality passes the acceptance criteria, and additionally can raise bugs if he finds any. And the process ends when the ticket gets closed. That's basically the process like schema. If we were to put it into a flow diagram to better assess the possible outcomes, we would start with the ticket that is provided by the client. The ticket would be developed and the functionality will get tested. And as we mentioned, there are 2 possible outcomes after this. If the acceptance criteria is met, the ticket is passed. This is kind of like the success and most efficient flow for a ticket to get from start to finish. But as we mentioned, there are a couple of things that could happen. So the acceptance criteria could not be met. So the ticket needs to be reopened, developed again, tested again, challenge the AC again, and then, hopefully it gets passed the second time. And the other thing that could happen was a bug could be found in the system that is not related to the functionality, but it needs to be raised and told to the client that it exists. If we talk about stuff that could harm the process, we did mention that the most efficient way of tickets going from start to finish is not being reopened and ideally finding no bugs in the system. So the first one would be finding bugs. We did mention that it's a simple product, trusted modules, no custom code. We have a trusted developer. He's a senior developer with a good track record. So we're guessing that that's not going to happen that much. You can make those assumptions. And the other one that might be a little bit more hurtful would be reopening, having to reopen tickets. Those are the 2 things that could hurt the process. And there we have it. We have the first 2 metrics. The metrics would be the number of bugs found and the number of reopened tickets. Sometimes though, it makes more sense to tailor the data a bit so it better reflects or it's easier to understand. When you talk about reopened tickets, you could actually express that as a proportion, so a ratio of tickets. Think about it as of all the tickets that go through the process, how many do not get reopened? It's sort of an efficiency. You reopen 1 out of 4 tickets. The value kind of makes more sense. Another good one would be to count the tickets that need to be reopened more than once. So what they're doing is kind of breaking through the redundancy that you're putting into the system. So that's worse. Okay, so we have our metrics. The question would be, what do you do once you've identified them and you have the values? So this is what's called taking care of metrics. And it's kind of implicit if you think about it. But the first thing you need to do is categorize things as good or bad. Usually you develop ranges. You don't talk absolutes. If we talk about the reopening of issues, they should be 0, and there should be no bugs found in the system. But in the real world, you need to have a tolerance value. So I would tolerate 1 out of 6 tickets being reopened, and that we find no more than 5 bugs per week. I don't know. And there are some processes though where you cannot actually have a clear understanding of what's the expected or the ideal value. In those cases, the only way to move forward is propose an initial one and start tracking it and see what the trend tells you about what's good or bad. That's not the case here. It's kind of straightforward to see what the best outcome would be. To do a quick sum up of what we've done so far, you basically first gather data and then interpret it. That data becomes information because it has meaning. I separated these steps because I want to stress that metrics need to have meaning. And after that, you need to categorize the result to see which ones are good or bad, and then just track them over time. Just make sure that they stay on that tolerance range. And another thing you could do is try to improve something that you feel could be improved or that you want to improve because of an executive decision. So to understand that, let's follow up on the example and we will provide a bit more of context. So we're working on an agile environment. This is to say that the time scale will be on sprints. Each sprint is usually 2 weeks, not necessarily, but it's just a time you need. And we're going to track our newborn metrics, the number of bugs found and the proportion of reopening. The proportion, again, I might refer to as efficiency in this case because it's the kind of efficiency of the process. If we look at the graphs, so far in the first 9 sprints of the project, we've never found more than 5 bugs per sprint, and our proportion of tickets that got through the process without being reopened is 76%, 75. That means that for every 4 tickets that go through the process, 1 gets reopened. What we're going to try and do in this follow-up is try to work on that efficiency. So you need to try and understand what the problem could be here. I just mentioned a couple of possible causes. So the code quality could be an issue, but as I mentioned, we have a senior developer with a good track record, so we're still not going to pursue that. It's not likely that that's the case. Another problem would be that the tickets are not written correctly, but that's easy to check. You just go to the tickets and read them. And let's suppose that they are actually describing a possible requirement interpretation. So they're not wrong per se. So having discarded those 2, let's act upon requirement gathering, meaning that the client provides a ticket that has a requirement interpretation, but for some reason that interpretation is different when the developer takes that ticket and actually performs the development. What we're going to propose to try and fix this is basically grooming sessions where the client and the developer get together and make sure that they understand the requirements so that when the developer develops something, it is actually what the client expected. And we've introduced these sessions, and the possible outcomes are basically 3. If we look at the graph of efficiency, we were at 75. And what happens is we could bump it up and have a successful impact on the process. We could have no impact because basically we see no change in the system. Or we could, the change could backfire on us and we could have a less efficiency than before. The good thing about this is that you can quantify it. You're not acting on gut feeling, and you're not saying grooming sessions should make the process better. You have quantifiable data that will let you see how that value has improved. And that's basically how you keep track of metrics and how you analyze when you do a change, how it impacts the system. Before we end the example, I want to introduce a second topic, which is very important, which is secondary metrics. Primary metrics are easy. They're the ones we've been talking about so far. They describe a condition in the process that helps understand the state of affairs. They should have a fast impact on the process, because if they don't, by the time you find out that the process is out of control, then considerable damage may have already been done. So you need a short time lag. And then it should not be open to manipulation, because for some reason, when reporting to management, people tend to try and portray a better image of the project. If the metric allows for people to behave like this, then it's not probably a good choice, and you need to try and rethink it. So basically, these are the ones that come to mind when you think about metrics, stuff you can work with. Now, if these are primary metrics, what is a secondary metric? While a primary metric measures what needs to be fixed, the secondary metric measures what must not be broken. It helps understand and have an overarching view of the state of operations, and it helps identify problem shifting. Trade-offs are normal. Usually something needs to be lost to make the process more efficient, but the idea is that it needs to be monitored explicitly. Like, you need to know how much you're losing on one side and weight it against the benefit. Let's go back to the example one last time so that we can make this point kind of clear. Again, a bit more of context. Let's say we actually introduced the grooming sessions, and it had a successful impact on the process. So the efficiency bumped up from 76 to 81%. So instead of 1 out of 4 tickets getting reopened, now it's 1 out of 5. And the secondary metric we were already tracking was velocity, which is basically the amount of tickets that get closed each sprint. So we're doing a ticket count, and that value was around 50 for the first 9 sprints before we introduced that change. So when we added the grooming sessions, we know that we bumped up the efficiency of the process to 81%, but tracking velocity, we see that we've lost 10 tickets when it comes to velocity. It's not a percentage, but it went from 50 to 40. Sorry about that. Now, this is not necessarily wrong. It might be that it takes a lot of time to go through these grooming sessions, but there is some correlation between the two of them. You might need to think about if it's just coincidence and it's just a period of the project, but there has been some negative impact on something that should not change. This means that it's not as easy as it seems to work on metrics. In this very simple example, you can see that there are multiple variables that can change and provide data for analysis, but it needs to be digested. So to wrap up the second question, how metrics, the most reasonable answer is that it requires a lot of effort and patience. You need strong analytical people that can assess projects and work with them, that feel comfortable being patient and tolerate, not being successful right away, because it's a process. It's a continuous improvement analysis that needs to be tailored to get to a state where you have confidence on it. And after all this, do you need metrics in your system? I started to think about instances where you wouldn't need metrics on your business, or your processes wouldn't need metrics. And I came up with a couple of things that could, astray you or make you think, okay, I actually don't need metrics, which would be that your business is not mature enough. So you have a lot of different project types, multiple technologies, and there's a lot of people coming and going, which leads to a morphing team structure. The second one I thought of was having no information. So basically there's no reporting, no ticketing system, no way of tracking the work that's being done, no meeting notes. And if you don't have, even though I said data gathering is not metrics, you need data to get metrics. So there's a problem there as well. And last one is when you don't have a clear defined process. So you have information that you could use, you have a certain stability on your organization, so you could double down, but you still haven't defined a process. So you still cannot get a metric if there's no process. So I do say this, that, you might not need a metric, but we've seen how metrics have all these benefits and talk about a mature business and mature processes and being able to quickly assess the sanity of it all. And that's actually why it's used as a buzzword, because those things are implicit when you use the word, like you have tailored processes within your system. So I'm going to try and change the question. Do I even need them? I think it's better to say, do I even need them right now? Everyone should strive to get to that place where you have efficient and well thought processes and they work. There's an auditing system that can tell you when some project goes astray. It is a very efficient and good way of working and knowing if your business is healthy. Okay, having said that, let's move on to the conclusion and we'll do a quick summary of what we went through. We started with a very simple example to understand the concept. Building a building is a process by itself, and it can benefit from analytical skills, analysis, and just going through particular values that can help you make the process more efficient. We know that in the software industry, processes are far more complex. There's a lot more technologies, more integrations, a lot more of platforms, delivery systems. It's insane. And especially, when you're talking about software development in particular, there are a lot of different stages, teams, communication, and this might be challenging if you understand what a metric is and what it would take you to get one. It might sound like there's a huge wall that you first need to cross in order to get them. But to be honest, there are strategies to tackle this. When you see this massive ocean, the one that worked, at least for us, was taking parts of the process bit by bit and try to define the process within that particular system. You might want to target the delivery system, what you're doing as far as deployments. You might want to target what you're doing for your testing practices. You might want to do what you're doing for your reporting structure. Once you isolate that and you start working on the process, you will see that it starts interconnecting and it sort of tiles down and everything is dominoes into having an overall system of metrics. And then you become a metric-driven business. So how do you get there? The first phase is quite simple, is make the decision. You need to say to yourself that you want to go through metrics and become a metric-driven organization. And once you do that, the first thing you need to do is understand the key factors or understand the different processes that you have in your company. Go through all we talked about, how, and start gathering information and metrics over your processes. And over time, you're gonna find that you will be able to tell which values correlate to a bad state, to things that you need to work on. And then you will have a reliable categorization. And when that is proven over time, when you've successfully improved processes and worked on problematics, then you would have done it. At that point, you already are metric driven and you can benefit from it. And you should never, you should never just rely on the system by itself. You should always question it and challenge it. So there's always a review process that always needs to follow up once you're done. But you will be metric driven and you will have all the benefits associated with it. So hopefully now metrics have meaning, not only the metrics that you will gather, but when you hear about it, you will understand what people are talking about, and no longer a buzzword for any of you. So thank you very much. At this point, if there's any questions. Okay, I'm seeing in the chat. Yeah, I got the chat open. I don't know if anyone has any question for me. Okay, so it seems no questions so far. What are the basic tools used? So that would depend a lot on how your business works. But usually the most useful source of information, at least for the the process-oriented metrics is having some sort of ticketing system. If you're working with software, it's kind of like the industry standard at this point. Everyone has either Jira or some equivalent. And if you work with it correctly, it can be a great tool. I don't think having the tool is enough, because you will then see people working with it with no clear understanding of how it works, and then going into the reports panel and thinking that the velocity chart will give them information about the current team. There's more effort that goes into having that velocity chart portray what's actually happening. What metric tool do you recommend? Google Analytics, Google Search Console? I think it is important to understand it, and then once you know the data that you're gathering, then the tool, you can just see what works best for you. In our case, like, we do tailoring ourselves. We just gather them through the ticketing system, through reports, and then make our own kind of report on sanity of processes. I think Google Analytics is not a it's kind of like in the data gathering area, where you see the user, how the user works with the platform, and you can gather data from that, but you need to process it or make sure that you start off with a clear understanding of what you're going to track, because the problem there is that there's a lot of information coming from that point. Like, what do you want to see? The URL that got people out of your platform, the landing URL, the time they took to find or search terms, what terms were searched. There's a lot of information that comes from Google Analytics, and you need to try and focus that. If not, you're going to get lost. Okay, and building up on the tools that are used, I think it's important to stay open to interpretation. Sometimes the tool itself will kind of guide you to get some values. Like I mentioned, there are report sections on most of them. You're going to see burn down charts, burn up charts, velocity charts, turnaround time, ticket life cycle. And those things kind of are values you could track, but don't disregard stuff that might be more important to your process. And also take into account that when you're tackling a problem, it's a good idea to tackle it from different angles and have redundancy to make sure that what you're tracking is okay. A good example would be, usually when a team reports to management, they portray the velocity of the team and the timeline of the project, just to make sure that they will be done on time. But that by itself is not enough. I would add metrics to it to make sure that you're actually gonna make it, because if you have the velocity that you've estimated for the project, but that's composed of half issues found in the system, then you're actually not targeting the requirements. You're fixing things that you've done in the past. So you need to account for those things. You need to have redundancy and challenge your own process. For example, I've seen reports where the timeline is built on a, 30-point velocity, and the velocity for the team is 15, and the timeline is not updated, or the velocity is not worked on. So why are you gathering them if you're not using them? So the tool needs to work for you. It needs to provide the information that you want to track. So again, the process would be identify problems or key factors, see what you can do to track them, and then choose a tool that provides the right information for tracking those traits.
You also have another question by Ella. What metric tool do you recommend? Google Analytics, Google Search Console?
Well, I did touch on that. I think Google Analytics are a source of data more than a metric system. They provide some calculations over the data that was gathered, but you need to make sure that it's not overwhelming. There's a lot of things, and you can get lost, sort of speaking. Thanks, Ella. Any other question? You're welcome. I think that one, I don't know how it works this year. Someone asked how to access the presentation later. Last year, they were posted in Drupal GovCon site. I'm guessing it's going to be the same thing this year.
Yeah, I believe you can upload your presentations to your session.
Oh, that's on me, right? Well, I'm gonna update the presentation there as soon as I'm done. I think the video was uploaded a couple of days later, right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I'll be updating. I'll be uploading my session as well. Oh, that's it. That's the answer. Well, I think if there are no more questions, we can probably give a couple more minutes for the people that come after so that they can prepare. Feel free if you have any more questions just to make them get through to me. My email is in my Drupal Gov session. I don't know if it's available to everyone, but you can reach me at Mobomo anytime you have any question about this session. That being said, thank you very much. I don't know if there's anything in particular we need to do to wrap this up.
No, I think you're fine.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone. And I'll be giving another presentation tomorrow about planning QA for your Drupal project. It's going to be kind of in the same lines. So if you want to hear that or interested in QA at all for your Drupal project, just tune in. Same time just tomorrow.
Thank you.
Well, thanks everyone. Have a great day.